Good afternoon from Policy Insights Forum, Strategic Leaders Series. Today we have Mr. Gilles Michaud. Mr. Michaud, welcome to the Policy Insights Forum.
Thank you so much for having me. My pleasure to be here.
To begin with, would you please describe for our audience your roles and responsibilities as the Undersecretary General for Safety and Security at the United Nations?
Yeah, definitely. So it's been, like you mentioned, Paul, it's been since July 2019. And the Undersecretary General for Safety and Security is basically delegated the responsibility from the Secretary General for the safety and security of UN personnel and their dependents. What that represents, it's 180,000 UN personnel and over 400,000 dependents or family members that are spread out globally. And when we talk about safety and security, it varies depending who you're speaking with. But in the UN system, on the security side, what it means, it's basically leadership and coordination of all security endeavors for UN personnel globally, which means basically looking at security operations, looking at policy development, looking at training, looking at compliance on policy. So that's the nature of the type of activities that I oversee. On the safety side of the business, it's limited to fire safety and also to road safety, because as one would know, we have a lot of our UN personnel that drive UN vehicles globally, and how road safety affects UN personnel is quite astonishing, because we see year over year, we lose more people. That means either that they get killed or that they lose their lives or are injured in road safety incidents than we have over security incidents. So this is why road safety for us is quite important. And then fire safety, because many of our headquarters facilities that we have over 11 of them globally, plus all of our compounds where we got UN staff that reside, we look after the fire safety aspects in these areas.
To help situate the conversation, would you kindly describe the contemporary operating environment of United Nations humanitarian workers and their partnered NGOs?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Paul, because context is everything. Right now, if we look at these statistics, there's over 330 million people in need of humanitarian assistance globally. And out of that 330 million, there's 230 million that receive direct UN support at a cost of $52 billion. That is the need, the requirements that exist right now for humanitarian aid globally. That being said, is that most humanitarian operations, and I would say the largest component of it, involves UN work in environments where that 95% occurs in conflict or armed conflict situations. So when you've got humanitarian needs, usually there's a direct correlation to insecurity. And this is the reality of where we've got our humanitarian personnel and those from our implementing partners where they operate. Even furthermore, it's when you look at the ICRC. So when they look at their own data, there's 64 million people that are in need of humanitarian assistance that live in areas that are not under what we would call government control. Mm-hmm. So that sets a bit of the stage to some of the challenges that we face. So then this leads to the notion of insecurity definitely impacts the work of humanitarian throughout the world.
Well, since the now historic attack on the United Nations facilities in Baghdad on 19 August of 2003, we've seen UN personnel subjected to a spectrum of targeted violence in the locations where they're conducting humanitarian efforts. As you're well aware, this has hampered the ability of UN personnel to operate under an umbrella of both safety and security. What are the human security risks and threats confronting the United Nations humanitarian workers specifically?
So when we look at security threats that UN personnel face, we divvy it out in different categories. One being non-state armed groups, and non-state armed groups that varies from violent extremists that have, I guess, identified UN as a direct target
Mm-hmm.
for all of their affiliates. It also speaks about what I would call political, ethnic, or even secular militias that exist. That falls within the category of non-state armed groups. Militarized criminal gangs that we see, for example, in Haiti. That's another example, and even up to private military companies
Yeah.
that operates now in different parts of the world. So non-state armed group pose a threat to UN operations. Criminality, so understanding that UN personnel in many instances live within the communities that they serve. So they're exposed as well to criminality that exists in those communities. Civil unrest is another element by which we look at threat to UN personnel. And oftentimes, what we see that is linked to civil unrest is what I would call mis and disinformation in relation to the work that the UN does on the ground. And that would lead the communities and population to rise against the UN operations in specific countries. Armed conflict is another major threat. And I think the best example of that is Ukraine right now, where we're operating in an environment that is facing active armed conflict. And the other one, also not to be forgotten, are natural disasters. And I think the best example of that is the recent earthquake in Turkey and northwest Syria. And for example, in northwest Syria, where uh, again, million of population that have been affected by it, and they live in an area that is controlled by non-state armed groups. So that is a bit of the some of the threats that our humanitarian and UN personnel at large face on a daily basis.
Could you describe what is the United Nations security risk approach to humanitarian operations?
Yes, and it's the distinction here is to humanitarian operations because the approach varies if we consider the development work that we do, the political work that we do, and when it comes to humanitarian type of work, because humanitarian you need to be a lot more closer to the communities. You need to access those communities. So this notion of humanitarian work is linked to saving lives, and because it's linked to saving lives, then we view our risk approach to it as it's the best way that I think that I can. The greater the needs, the more that we will tolerate risks.
Okay.
And this exists in the humanitarian landscape. The other aspect as well is that um, we are also operating in an environment, and like I explained earlier, around where we need to go. Some of these areas are controlled by non-state armed groups, are not under government control. So in humanitarian work, we need to engage with those that do control those areas for access. So that means negotiating with some of these actors, that it be criminals, that it be terrorists, that we need to negotiate access with them so that we can deliver programs to the people in need. The other element as well, when we look at our risk approach, is what we define as community acceptance. That is one of the factors that we look at when we do our risk assessment is are the non-state armed groups that are operating in that area, do they accept us or not? Do they tolerate our presence because we're helping their communities? Same thing for the communities themselves. Sometimes they're the ones that exercise pressure to say, well, we need the UN or we need the implementing partners to be present. And that is always an element that we consider in our approach to risk assessment in the humanitarian context.
Since you assumed your post and considering your experience, where are the humanitarian workers most exposed to security threats, and how does the United Nations mitigate these?
Okay, and without going over an hour of explanation, because there's a lot that goes into it. And I think the best way, Paul, to describe it is there are areas where I would describe the UN being exposed to direct threats. And those would be, for example, in the Sahel, Somalia, because of the operations of Al-Shabaab, Haiti with some of the criminal gangs that operate specifically in Port-au-Prince, Eastern DRC, Afghanistan, Northern Mozambique, where there's a big ISIS presence in Cabo Delgado, Yemen as well, where there's a presence of Al-Qaeda in Yemen. And interestingly enough, in Yemen, when you look at the threats, like the northern part of Yemen that is controlled by the Houthis is oftentimes seen as more secure than the southern part of Yemen because of the presence of AQ elements that operate in that area. So those are some of the countries or regions by which we are exposed to direct threats. And then there are other parts of the world where it's more indirect, where it's not necessarily that the UN is a direct target, of these threats, but more so because they're operating or we're operating in conflict zones. So, for example, Ukraine, like I mentioned, is one where we're very active. Myanmar is another area where we face indirect threats. The occupied Palestinian territories, that it be the West Bank or that it be Gaza, for example, where we operate there as well, that it's more indirect threats that we face because of some of the ongoing conflict. Then the second part of your question, Paul, around how do we mitigate those threats or those risks, I should say, is where we face direct threats. Basically, we train our people to raise their awareness around security. And so, for example, how to negotiate a checkpoint when they get to a checkpoint, how to negotiate access, for example, how to react if ever they're taken hostage, which is another element of our daily lives in the UN, where right now I've got 5 of my personnel in Yemen that have been held hostage for the past year. So trying to expose staff as to how to react to those type of situations. We also provide equipment, that it be personal protective equipment, that it be vehicles, armored vehicles, radio communications, for example, or equipment that helps us mitigate some of the risks that we face. In some instances, and I'll speak maybe a bit this more later, but armed escorts. We will hire private security companies, or even will be provided armed escorts by host government security institutions. So those are in areas where we face direct threats. Where we face indirect threats, there's another element. So all of these mitigation measures are introduced, but also indirect is that where we will utilize this notion of notification, where we will notify the parties that are part of the conflict of our presence or our intention to be present in a specific area that we need to access. And this way they're aware and they have the responsibilities to basically ensure that the safety and security of UN personnel while they're there is maintained. So those are some of the elements around how we mitigate the risks in the areas where we operate that we're facing either direct or indirect threats from these different threat actors.
You touched on an interesting point in relation to UN employees. How are they trained to minimize such threats? And is it sufficient enough, in your opinion? And what would be the desired end state in training your people?
We can never, I'll start with the end of your question. We can never provide enough training. And that is something, as much as we've got efforts that are deployed across the entire UN system. So it's not just my department, but it's also agencies, funds, and programs that have their own security elements for which I am accountable for at the end of the day, that they provide a lot of training to their staff. But the type of training that we provide, for example, there's mandatory online training that is more about security awareness to ensure that staff try to avoid putting themselves into security or insecurity situations. Then there's the other element of another mandatory training in specific areas where they face direct threats. And this is an in-person 1 week training where they're exposed to, like I said, negotiating a checkpoint, understanding how to react when, if ever, they were to be taken hostage, and so on and so forth. We also train our personnel on first aid, CPR, and also advanced first aid. So utilizing trauma bags if ever somebody were to get hurt. So those type of training are offered depending where staff are being deployed. There's also the notion of, I talked about negotiation of checkpoints and notification, deconfliction. So the civil and military deconfliction, how to negotiate access, that is something that is also the type of training that is offered to UN staff. There are other elements of training as well that we do, and those are training for our own security personnel, how to do their job better, which in fact that brings a level of, I would say, credibility, but also reassurance to UN personnel at large and humanitarians that the advice that they're getting, the advisories that they're getting, the support that they're getting is top notch. So there's a cadre of training that we offer our security professionals. And then there's also training that we offer to our decision making, or decision makers, sorry. And this is where basically the accountability framework for security, and as much as I am delegated the authority from the SG, is that in every country where we've got a UN presence, usually the most senior UN person in country is designated as the designated official for security. That person has the authority to make decisions for the safety and security of personnel up to where we face high risk. Anything that is very high risk and above needs to come to me. So we need to make sure that those decision makers are trained on how to manage a crisis situation, on how to understand the accountability framework for safety and security of personnel, how to manage their security management team, and so on and so forth. So there's another level of training as well that we offer to those who are involved in those type of decision-making positions. Again, I think we could always offer more. I think we're always looking at also some of the training that's offered by member states. For example, we have some member states that support us in providing or raising the standards of our training. For example, close protection. So those bodyguards that we deployed, that it be with the Secretary General or that it be with the most senior UN official in country in high-risk environments, we've got a specific member state that offers us the training for a close protection officers. So we've got other types of more specialized training that some member states offer, and I'm always, I guess, on the lookout for opportunities for enhanced training for UN staff.
Well, as you know, under humanitarian law, the safety and security of United Nations humanitarian workers are the responsibility of host nations. Has this been effective?
Yes, and this is, and first of all, if this was not a factor, I would not have a job. And I explain myself because at the end of the day, and it's not just under humanitarian law, it's under the UN Charter, and where host government have the responsibility for safety and security of UN personnel. And my job entails that it's to identify the gaps that exist between what the host government are able to provide us and what we need for the safety and security of UN personnel. And my job is to fill that gap. So I think that plays on a daily basis. You've got countries where there's no issues, like there's not many risk mitigation measures that we need to put in place because host government are providing an environment by which it's mainly secure. We always face criminal acts and whatnot, but the high threat activities don't exist. While mainly in many countries where we do have bigger risk or higher risks, it's in where there's insecurity, and usually where there's insecurity is because those governments are unable to provide security throughout their area of responsibility. So this is where I think that it's a challenge that exists for us. Interestingly enough, though, is that we are faced in situations where sometimes the support from the host government raises risks for humanitarians. And I'll give you an example of that, is that in communities where there's distrust of their own government and communities where we need to access, having humanitarians show up with armed escorts from host government is basically is an impediment to us delivering programs and community acceptance, like I explained earlier. So there's a good and there's a bad, I guess, to this notion of host government responsibilities and how they go about providing or acting on those responsibilities. Sometimes it's good, and sometimes it's a challenge. So it's an area for that needs my engagement on a regular basis in negotiating with the highest level of government on the level of security that they provide for us in their respective countries.
How can United Nations member nations mitigate these challenges? And secondly, how can United Nations members assist in the safety and security of United Nations humanitarian workers?
So that is a very good question, and so from my at least from my perspective and what I've seen is that the notion of neutrality of the UN, the humanitarian principles that exists, and I would say host government respecting those is key. And because sometimes there is this notion of I guess host government questioning neutrality of UN personnel, UN agencies, especially for example when we're negotiating with terrorist organizations for access, when in fact they're trying to get rid of these terrorist elements in their country, that would bring a host government to question our neutrality. And so it's a human, I guess, a human dynamic that exists. But I think that in many instances, I think that the notion of respecting that neutrality of UN agencies and what we do is key. The other element is for them to invest in security, and this is where sometimes even them they need support from bilateral partners in doing that. I think the best example that I can use is Somalia. And Somalia right now, they've got I was there back in January, and the government in place have very good intentions in respect to combating Al Shabaab and trying to dislodge them from communities that they've been in for the past 12 or 15 years. But they cannot do it alone. They need support from bilateral partners. They need support from the African Union. They need support, and I know that U.S. government are investing a lot of energy in supporting the Somali government in disrupting the activities of Al Shabaab. So I think the notion of investing in security institutions is key, and sometimes that requires support from bilateral partners. I think the same thing we can speak about is Haiti is a perfect example. And right now, like Haiti, it's very challenging for the Haitian National Police to do it on their own. And understanding that the Canadian government is looking at ways of trying to support them the best way that they can. So those are type of examples where further investment in security would be required.
How can the United Nations and the international community effectively enhance the overall safety and security of humanitarian workers, and perhaps, in particular, Canada?
I don't have the data, but if you look at Canada, Canada is a significant investor globally in humanitarian aid. And I spoke earlier about the fact that this year there's a requirement for $52 billion in contribution from donors. I'm not saying that's all coming from Canada, it's not. But Canada is playing a good part in that. But that $52 billion, I think that where Canada needs to invest, they need to invest what I would call in an insurance policy. And that insurance policy, that is security. Because if 95% of the areas where humanitarian assistance is required is in insecure environments, your money's going nowhere if you don't invest in security. And so that means two things. And this is not just for Canada, this is for other member states and donors, is that if you're going to be investing $52 billion in humanitarian aid, I think that there's a small percentage of that that should be going towards security. That is part of your insurance policy to make sure that your programs that you're investing in gets delivered and gets to the beneficiaries. The other element as well is that I've identified some of the gaps that I have in my department. And one of the biggest gap that I have is in respect to emergency response. What I mean by that is that when a crisis hits, it takes me or it takes my department too much time to react to it, to be able to deploy security, additional security assets, to be able to support program delivery. And this is where investing again in a small team that can be deployed within 48 hours to be on the ground, to assess the needs, to provide the initial response, to supplement the capacity that I already have on the ground, that is key. The other element of that insurance policy is what I call the digital transformation for my department. Because any security related decision is based on information. And how that information is accessed, how that information is analyzed, how quickly, by whom, is another gap that I feel that I have in my department. I need also to bring, I guess, technology as an opportunity for me. As much as it is a threat from other elements of security, there's an opportunity that exists there to better use technology that exists right now, and those are gaps that exist. And this is where I feel that Canadian government and other governments should be looking at investing in order to ensure that their overall commitment to humanitarian aid, they get the biggest bang for their buck.
If you were to do a bit of blue sky thinking, what would be your thoughts on the ideal initiatives to ensure an optimal environment in which United Nations humanitarian workers could deliver on their work safely?
Well, if you're going to talk about blue sky, I would say peace on earth would be, if we could get peace on earth, that would be easy. But it's not the case. And talking about blue sky, I would talk about the blue flag. And this is the notion of respecting the blue flag of the UN. And this is where there's less and less of that. And we've seen that ever since the Canal Hotel bombing back in 2003, August 19, 2003, where we've seen many elements, and you referred to it, Paul, earlier, of UN personnel being targeted. So this notion of respecting the UN flag would be, I guess, optimal for us to be able to operate. But that is unrealistic. And I know that is not, that will not happen, either peace on earth or that respect of the blue flag in the short or midterm, that's for sure. So I think in the meantime, I think the notion is of optimizing my ability through investment in my resources. Investment, and when I say investment in my resources, it doesn't mean I need more resources. I need more money. There's some money that I need to be more effective, and that will lead to being more efficient. And this is where I'm looking to that. I would say the basis of my strategic plan for this department is based on that. So investing in the existing resources that I have and bringing in a more diversified workforce for me is important, because a diversified workforce brings in diversity of thought, which leads to better decision making. Investing in, like I said, digital transformation is also something that we need to take full advantage of the information that is out there, the data that exists. And another point here, Paul, I think that is important to understand. You're probably asking yourself, well, Gilles, like, don't you have access to all this intelligence to be able to make those decisions? No, 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 no. Intelligence, I'll have to be careful here, is that the word intelligence in the context of information in the UN does not exist because of our neutrality. So we don't operate in an environment where we collect intelligence. We rely on open source information. We rely on data that is collected by everybody that are willing to share with us. And this is where, like, I think we need to, there's more and more data collection, data analysis that exists, that it be from the private sector, public sector, and so on. And I think there are opportunities there that exist for me to tap into that, to lead to better decision-making, that would lead to better safety and security for humanitarians globally.
Mr. Gilles Michaud, United Nations Undersecretary for Safety and Security, thank you for your time and valuable insights on the issues relating to the safety and security of humanitarian workers and their initiatives globally. Thank you, sir.
Well, I thank you so much, Paul, for this and this opportunity. I think that to be able to explain to a wider audience as to what we do and the challenges that that we're facing in the UN, but specifically for humanitarian workers, I think this is key, and I thank you for the interest. And I'm sure that the impact that this will have, hopefully, on our ability to better support humanitarian workers out there.
Take care.
Be safe out there.